Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 10th, 2023, and here we go. Just a few days ago, the Iowa Republican Party started the 2024 nomination process by officially scheduling the 2024 GOP caucuses for the Republican Party, GOP already said, for the 2024 nomination. Now, this decision puts the Iowa caucuses at a very early point, just 6 months away. Yes, 6 months away from where we are today, actually less than that as of now, 179 days until the GOP caucuses and 180 days until we know the winners, hopefully, God willing, of the 2024 Iowa caucus. Now, this really just started our countdown to an exciting and important presidential election cycle. This is the first time we've heard any news from the state of Iowa about when their caucuses are going to go. Now, this decision puts the Iowa caucus about a month earlier than where it was in the 2016 GOP primary, but about 2 weeks later than where it was back in 2012 and in 2008. There doesn't seem to be an intentional strategic reason behind this GOP nomination decision. I think that they've always wanted to be first in the nation, so sometimes it had to be done in the month of January. But it does put us at a very interesting point because we are starting our countdown now, less than a half year away until the GOP caucuses in the state of Iowa, which will be very, very fascinating. So I've decided that as we head into our full swing of primary season for the GOP side, that we would be doing this update on where the numbers were every month out until the Iowa caucus and then continuously throughout the primary season. And I think that puts us in a really good position starting today, at least. Now that we have the official news broken that the presidential caucuses are going to be relatively soon, we can start taking a look at how the numbers change over time. This serves as an amazing starting point for this trend line that we will follow over the next couple of months. Now, there isn't much to be interesting about this article that's written about here. Main thing to note is that it's earlier than 2020, obviously, and then earlier than 2016, but 2 weeks later than 2012 and 2008. It looks as if, the Iowa caucus is going to be the first in the nation. Now, it typically is, but there is some consideration on the Democratic side about the rearrangement of the primary calendar, and there's questions, okay, does the caucuses count as a primary in essence, in terms of scheduling? And a lot of people are saying yes, no, maybe, right? But on the GOP side, it's pretty clear cut. They're fine with their calendar. They're fine with the way things have gone from Iowa to New Hampshire to South Carolina to Nevada, and that looks like where it's going to stay for at least the initial 4. But this Iowa caucus point really goes to show that this is not some type of far away election. The GOP primary is actively happening today. It's actively happening now, and we've known that for quite some time. But with about 6 months until Iowa, we can't really expect that many more people to enter in the race, but maybe we'll see some surprise entrances. Now, at this point in time, about 8 years ago, we were seeing some of the final announcements for the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump was getting in the race. You had already seen the announcements from Jeb Bush, many big names too, Ben Carson, Rand Paul, Chris Christie. A lot of these people have been preparing their bids for years, some of them decades, and they'd already been announced. But this was around the time you started to see things wind down. But the primaries, or the caucus, occurred in February rather than in January in 2016. It gave people a few more weeks around this point 8 years ago that a lot of people simply don't have for this time around. Now, that isn't to say that the field isn't already too crowded. You have over 12 candidates in the race, 12 major ones, and it's already starting to be a two-way race between the top contenders, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. But that's set to change because, as you can see in some of these polls, they don't always agree about the stances or the points or the positions that some of these candidates are in. For instance, a poll done between the 14th and the 15th by Harvard-Harris shows Ron DeSantis at just 14% versus another one done just 2 days later from Yahoo News that shows him at 24%. There's differences in these numbers, but the averages tell us a story that we should watch, a story we should look for when we look at Iowa. Now, I'm intrigued to see what Iowa ends up doing, largely because historically, they have not been super accurate. In 2016, they chose Ted Cruz. In 2012, they chose Rick Santorum. And in 2008, they chose Mike Huckabee. The standard trend line here, for the past 3 open elections, they have never chosen the right candidate. But this time it looks like they might, or at least that's what the early indicators are telling us. The presidential election polls in 2024 pretty much show Donald Trump dominating the Iowa caucuses, up by 23 in nonpartisan polls. In fact, American greatness is largely associated with Ron DeSantis. Donald Trump with McClellan and Associates sponsored this poll in Iowa, showing him up by 32, showing him up by 27 in a head-to-head matchup, up by 15 in another, up by 16, 23. Then there were ones done by Ron DeSantis' super PAC himself, the Never Back Down super PAC that shows him still leading 2 points in a head-to-head, 10 points on the overall spread, and it doesn't look like that's going to narrow down before Iowa. So it looks like the general understanding here is that Donald Trump does win Iowa. But winning Iowa, I think, would be monumental, not only because, yes, it does set up somebody for an eventual victory in the primary, because it would mark the first time Iowa being correct. It would set the tone for the rest of the nation, and it would continue to do so and have an ultimate sense of importance as we go into future elections. I think the momentum that can be built here also cannot be understated. I mentioned it just a moment ago as if it was an already assumed part, but it is a very, very important one because momentum is everything. Without momentum, Donald Trump might not have been the nominee in 2016. What I mean by that is if you had thrown Ohio in the early phases, if you had thrown, Texas in the early phases, some very big states where Donald Trump didn't do so well, maybe there would have been that rise for Ted Cruz, that rise for John Kasich. They ultimately ended up in second and fourth, respectively, but that largely was due to the fact that there were consistent primary victories from Super Tuesday, then Super Tuesday 2, then 3, that were large for Donald Trump, and intermittently, there were victories for Ted Cruz. Now, that's just the way the primary calendar was set up, and Donald Trump obviously appealed and invested and campaigned to different places for different reasons, but a lot of it had to do with the scheduling in the way that, had it been rearranged slightly differently, maybe Ted Cruz would have been the nominee to Hillary Clinton in 2016, and maybe he would be running for the third time in this election. I don't know. Obviously a hypothetical, but just for consideration. Now, looking at Iowa in specific, as a caucus, it pulls in a different crowd than what you might expect for a primary. Essentially, caucuses are generally geared for for a younger audience. That might sound surprising, but those who typically have the most free time, the ability to sway back and forth, to stay for final count for the Iowa caucuses, typically are young voters. What I mean by that is you have people that are ages 20 to 30 that are able to stay in a place for 3 to 4 hours, depending on when they attend, when they show up, that can go ahead and vote and be swayed and listen to speeches and whatever it might be. You have people who are able to do that versus a primary where it's just submit an absentee, go in person and vote in just a few minutes and get that counted. It's more evident on the Democratic side, I think, if you see the engagement with young voters, with the engagement of older voters in states that held both primaries and caucuses. Hillary Clinton would win the primary, then Bernie Sanders would win the caucus, and that's not super surprising. Again, it has to do with the amount of time people have, the amount of energy they have, but generally speaking, the GOP audience tends to lean older anyway, so I don't think it will be much of a concern, but it might be interesting to see the difference in a more youthful electorate versus an older one. We will see, though, what happens here. Now, the Iowa caucuses, as I said, already show a lead for Donald Trump. But luckily, we also have a forecast that can accompany it from race to the White House. I talked about the 2024 GOP primary nomination forecast that they released just a few days ago. And the Iowa caucuses really have an interesting result here because it shows you what they expect and what they expected from before. The projected vote share here is that Donald Trump falls short of just under 50%. Now, there isn't really too much of a significant notion here, but in a 12-way race, that is quite significant. Now, Ron DeSantis is still expected to gain roughly a fourth of the vote when it comes down to the Iowa caucus, but even then, I'm not impressed by DeSantis' performance. The delegate projection here is that Donald Trump wins 20 delegates, nearly half of what the entire state has to offer. Ron DeSantis receives 9, Mike Pence receives 2, and then it sort of breaks down amongst the remaining candidates. Now, they also will show you where the expectations were earlier on this year. Back in February, they expected Ron DeSantis to be getting 20 and Donald Trump to be getting 13. But you can see that before Ron DeSantis announced, his numbers started to get worse, and since the announcement, have continued to get worse. You can also see that in terms of a head-to-head matchup, which we can go ahead and actually adjust for here, that Donald Trump still very much maintains a lead. This head-to-head matchup is a very interesting one because it isn't super likely in Iowa, but even then, it still shows that Donald Trump is maintaining a significant lead over Ron DeSantis. Whereas previously, Ron DeSantis had been up by 12, today he's down by about 13. that also is just a fascinating thing to look at, to see the consolidation not entirely fall in line behind Ron DeSantis. I think the unsure column will really make or break the race if they all split to Ron DeSantis, but I just don't think that they will. Iowa will be just an interesting case in general because it's the first time that we will see this primary process in full force. This is the first time we will see the Republican Party really having their voices heard on the national level. And it'll be interesting. It'll be a very important one, too, I think, to get a general indicator about where the remainder of these candidates are going to go, who's going to be VP, who's going to end up in the administration, who's going to drop out and endorse Trump because they realize that this guy is unstoppable, the same way Lindsey Graham did after the election or Chris Christie did slightly before the election, right? People who realized maybe I need to get on the Trump train or it's going to leave me behind. Or it could be on the flip side. Ron DeSantis could shock us all. It also could be wrong again, right? Ron DeSantis could have a surprise, shocking positive showing in Iowa that ultimately would end up being a collapse in future elections. We don't know what will happen, but right now, with 6 months to go until the Iowa caucuses, Donald Trump is in a very, very good position. And the 6-month countdown only makes it that much more real because it means that in just a few months, in fact, a month from now, the GOP primary debate is going to happen. You are going to see multiple GOP primary debates. You are going to see multiple people enter and exit the race because they realize that right before the primary is not really where you want to be if you're polling at just 0.3% nationwide, right? This is crunch time for the GOP. And from there, it's rapid fire. You jump to New Hampshire, you jump to South Carolina, then Nevada, then it's Super Tuesday. You have 8 states, 9 states, 10 states, depending on what the calendar ultimately ends up doing. And Iowa is the kickoff, but it is a very, very fast sprint all the way to June. The convention usually will end around April, May, as it has in years past, because at that point in time, you're reaching a good spot in the convention. Now, this interesting thing too, the way the forecast, what it shows us is that they also have an estimation about an after Nevada scenario between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis should everybody else drop out. And I'm telling you as a spoiler alert, it doesn't get that much worse for Donald Trump. In fact, his expectations actually increase because there's not as many people taking away from him. I think they expect Donald Trump at the baseline to do quite well in a never consolidated field, but I can certainly imagine that there are candidates out there, like ones that are voting for Nikki Haley, that would shift over to Trump rather than DeSantis, or people that are more loyal to Trump narrowly, though you will see that this margin really doesn't change much by just over 100 delegates when there's thousands in contention here. But it's still important to note. And you can see that after Nevada, if only Trump and DeSantis end up in the race, that Donald Trump still wins decisively, according to this forecast, in every state but Tennessee, Utah, and Wisconsin, in 47 states out of 50. What a phenomenal result for President Trump, a very good one, and an indicator as to why Iowa matters so much. Why this, what is considered a narrow win, which is a 27% victory over the second place candidate considered to be a narrow win, translates into states like South Carolina with a decisive win. States like Nevada with a narrow win, but still one that's decided by 26 points. States like Florida, Ron DeSantis' home state, expected to get 60% of the vote. Texas expected to get 62% of the vote. California, 53%. New York, 72%, right? There are reasons to believe why Iowa is setting Donald Trump up for success and is continuing, actually not setting up because we can't, give credit to Iowa for what Donald Trump has already done for his campaign, but it props him up even more. It shows that the first in the nation state overwhelmingly supports the former president, and many are going to follow suit. So now that we've reached this point where this has become a very, very real time, it also means that Donald Trump has 6 months to screw up, and all the other candidates have 6 months to catch up, right? This is crunch time for everybody, and we will see things start pouring out and out and out. Because if a poor showing happens at Iowa, you're out of the race. If your name isn't Ron DeSantis and you end up in the low single digits in Iowa, it's time to drop out of the race. None of these candidates are going to have a Bill Clinton comeback kid moment. None of these candidates are going to have a Joe Biden comeback kid moment. No one is going to be that. Because the way these primary systems are set up, especially on the Republican side, with many non-proportional winner-take-all states, with the rapid fire that these states will come, with the way that the GOP primaries have occurred in the past, if you aren't doing well in Iowa, you are out of the race. Or at least you should be, otherwise you're wasting your staffers' time, your money, and you're wasting the name recognition that you can carry over to the next election because you look like you're just a sore candidate who doesn't want to enter out of the race. That is the problem here. It's all about perception. It's all about propping up your future bids because there are candidates like Mitt Romney in 2008 that came in second place in Iowa that became the nominee. Romney in 2012, still losing Iowa, but eventually went on to win. There are interesting things to look at. There's, a very, very important way to look at these primaries, way to analyze them, way to understand them, and we will see what happens here. But Iowa matters. We have 5 months and 3 weeks and 5 days left to go until Iowa, 179 days until Iowa happens, 180 until we know the winner. 6 months out, 6 months starting now, and I think all eyes should be focused on the GOP primary because it will be a very interesting and tumultuous next half year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 Republican primary election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.